You used to work at the BBC, obviously. How would you sum up your time there?
I would say that it was a period of contrast. I loved working on Newsnight. Newsnight was a show that, like, as a sort of sad, politically obsessed teenager in Birmingham, I used to watch it, at 10:30 in my room on my little telly in the room, and it never got old. When Kirsty Walk or Emily or whoever it was, would say, and now our policy editor, Lewis Goodall, joins us, or whatever it happened to be, or he's been reporting on this, and that was always so thrilling. I always sort of lionized the BBC, really. As I said in the piece that I've written for the Statesman, I think that I probably wouldn't be a political journalist if it wasn't for the BBC. And I think probably for a lot of kids from a working class background who were interested in politics, the BBC, particularly at that time when it was still more hegemonic, was a kind of like gateway into different worlds that, that you just wouldn't have any exposure to, both politically, but also in terms of other things as well. So, I'm very proud of the work that I did there on all sorts of different things. I worked with some amazing colleagues under an amazing editor, Esme Wren. But it was difficult. It was difficult because, it was difficult from almost as soon as it was announced I was leaving Sky to do it, because, there were stories from somewhere in kind of, the Express and the Mail, basically being like, ministers won't go on Newsnight because of this guy, because they don't like what he's been saying about Brexit, Sky and whatever. And then it got kind of worse when, Robbie Gibb, who joined the board, who actually used to be my boss at the BBC, funnily enough. I think maybe he thought he's had better days, but anyway, he started tweeting very vociferously about me for a piece that I wrote for the New Statesman about the exams crisis in 2020, and I just sort of felt his presence a lot, which was quite difficult. People would often warn me that he was watching me, or there was a target on my back. And as always with the BBC, sometimes I've heard people say this week, or go on Twitter, no one's being able to say what Robbie Gibb or whoever, what do they do? And the thing is, it misunderstands what the BBC is like. Very, very often, the BBC is one of those organizations where no one says, or no one needs to do anything. It's all through sort of Chinese whispers. It's all through, there's a feeling that things are being said. You should be careful about this. And you try and sort of boil down, well, what is that? Who is saying that? And no one wants to be concrete, and no one wants to be specific, but everyone knows what it is. And so that period was difficult, yeah.
Well, Robbie Gibb's name has come up an awful lot in relation to the BBC's most recent scandal, the Michael Prescott dossier, that raised all those issues of impartiality, and the way the BBC has responded from that. Tell us a little bit more about that role. Like, who is he? What job was he meant to be doing? How were his interactions surprising, perhaps, or not surprising, in the context of Newsnight? And what's your perception of his role in this? Because some people are suggesting that it's a bit of a conspiracy. Other people are sort of saying, there have been Labour figures on the board of the BBC for many, many years, and we never got upset about them. How should we view Robbie Gibb?
Look, the first thing, I think there's been the reaction to this Prescott stuff and the Gibb stuff has sort of split inevitably, particularly on X and in sort of political discourse in two, right? You've sort of just alluded to it. There's a kind of school of thought which to say this is a sort of part of a massive right-wing conspiracy, and someone like Robbie Gibb and some of the people who are his henchmen in a way within the BBC are trying to destroy the BBC from within. And another school of thought is that there's absolutely nothing to see here. For goodness sake, why are you attacking the only Conservative on the board? This is the guy, in a sense, who there's a response to this, which is to say this Prescott report says that the BBC is not impartial on a variety of sort of right-wing areas, and you're going to sack the only right-wing guy? Those are the two schools. There is a third school, right, which I've tried and write about in the piece that I've written for you, which is to say that, look, my impression of Robbie Gibb, and also some of the people who are his sort of allies within the BBC, is that they genuinely believe that they are saving the BBC from itself. They genuinely believe that they are the sort of fly in the ointment of the BBC. They believe that they are the ones who, they are surrounded by this kind of liberal, hegemonic groupthink that everyone else at the organisation can't resist and is just part of. And they are the ones constantly sounding the alarm and constantly trying to right the ship because they care about the BBC. And to be fair to Robbie, he spent, before he joined Theresa May, as her director of communications. Although his politics within the BBC were well known, when I was a very young producer, he and I used to have very sort of spirited debates where he would sort of advocate things like a sort of flat income tax and defend kind of a lot of kind of, quite right-wing foreign policy, George W. Bush, all this sort of thing. His politics were well known, as were his Brexit views. But he spent a long time at the BBC in charge of its political output, and I don't doubt that he cares about its future. The mistake that I think people like Robbie and others like him make is this. I think they think that their politics somehow is not partial and everybody else's politics is. They seem to think that the politics that they represent is some sort of default view shared with the rest of the country. And everyone else within the BBC, as part of this kind of liberal cabal, are a kind of aberration. Basically, everyone else have orthodoxies, but we don't. And my problem with Robbie is this, and there's twofold. It's that people like him don't recognize that their politics are politics just like everybody else's. And that secondly, somehow they themselves are the kind of custodian of what impartiality is when they're not. The fact of the matter is someone, lots of people, as you'd imagine, I've been speaking to lots of people at the BBC this week. As I've written and talked about before, I wasn't an impartial person when I was at the BBC. There's no such thing as an impartial person. If you are an impartial person, my argument always was, I don't know what you're really doing in political journalism, because, it's an odd thing to be interested in political journalism and not in some way be political. But the point is this, if you're working at the BBC, it is possible, just like in any other kind of job which requires a level of impartiality, it is possible to not be an impartial person, but to act impartially. And make mistakes, of course, but those are your instincts. And that is what, in my experience, the vast majority of people at the BBC did and do, or at least endeavoured to do. What Robbie's and other people like him, their contention somehow, is that they don't do that. And what I would say is this, is that I would have a lot more time for the Prescott report, which, of course, Prescott is a sort of, close friend of Robbie. I would have a lot more time for that report if it included a whole diverse panoply of ways in which there have been complaints about BBC impartiality on the left and the right. If it included, for example, complaints about lack of Green or Lib Dem representation, or over-representation of Reform, or soft-ball interviews with people from Reform, or criticisms of the way that the BBC often plays into conventional right-wing economic orthodoxies, if it was a whole suite of critiques that was examining each and every one in turn, then I'd have a lot of time for it. But of course it's not. Of course it's not. It's a checklist of the familiar complaints from the right and sometimes radical right that, as someone like David Aronovich has shown in his writing about it this week, very often is full of inaccuracy or is itself partial. One of the problems with this debate this week has been treating somehow the Prescott report as if it is in itself inherently impartial. It is not. You only have to read it to see that for yourself. And just, I know this is a very long answer, but very, very briefly, the second area in which I think there is a problem with Gibb, and you're right, there have been political appointees on the left to the board as well. If you talk to people at the BBC, they will tell you, and I experienced this myself, they have never known a member of the board to be as active, as a non-executive member of the board, to be as active and as interventionist as Robbie Gibb, getting involved in all sorts of different matters of policy and standards, and even individual members of staff. It was completely outrageous for him to be getting involved in anything that I was doing as an individual member of staff, as a member of the board. Likewise, that is rinsed and repeated and again and again. And he's doing that because he genuinely believes that he is saving the BBC. But in my view, he's contributing to the partiality that he claims that he is trying to prevent.
Yeah, and I think the point about there being complaints or criticisms of the BBC from the left as well as the right is a really key one. That point about difference in coverage, that's something that the Lib Dems have been really discussing quite a lot, how Lib Dems get covered as opposed to how Reform get covered. If you look at the number of MPs they have, things like taking live footage of Reform press conferences, just the focus on anything that sort of Farage does. And you can make a case for doing all of those things, right? Because Reform are leading the polls, but you can also compare it to how the BBC has covered smaller parties or fringe parties in the past and go, hang on, there's a discrepancy here, and similar things with guests on flagship programs like Question Time and
Rachel, that's
Politics
the point
Live.
as well. And exactly, and the point that you're making there is one of my problems with this whole discourse about institutional bias. And as I say, I'm in lots of ways I'm not a big defender of the BBC. I think it's got huge problems. I think it's often stodgy and its coverage is banal, and I think that it can be arrogant, and conceited, and opaque, and all sorts of different things. But this idea of kind of an institutional bias to the left, what you've just described there about reform, and I agree. You can make different judgments. That's the point. They're judgment calls. Very often they're editorial judgment calls. There is no book of impartiality. There is no sort of platonic mean of impartiality that you can just sort of reach down from somewhere and say that's impartial. What we're talking about here fundamentally is a series of subjective judgments. And of course, because you're talking about subjective good judgments, by definition, people will make mistakes. But what that does not equate to is a fundamental institutional bias in one direction. In my experience, the BBC's fundamental institutional bias was towards wherever the establishment was at that given moment, wherever the consensus view was at that given moment. And so, yeah, I'm sure you can point to things in like the early part of this decade at the height of the identitarian politics, for want of a better expression, the woke kind of moment, and say the BBC had coverage which reflected that. I guarantee now the BBC, now there's been a shift in the other direction, there will be things the BBC does now that in 5 years' time, when there's a shift again, people will look back to and say, that was biased, wasn't it? Not necessarily. What it was is probably a reflection of where politics was at that moment, which the BBC is by no means immune to.
Well, you talk about subjectivity in decision making and mistakes. One of the decisions/mistakes kind of at the heart of this is that edit of Trump's speech in the Panorama program on January the 6th. And you've got, I'd invite listeners to read your piece on this, because you're quite punchy on how serious you think that error or that decision on splicing those quotes is, which other people have different views on. But just taking aside what you think of that edit, you also think that the Trump threat of a $1 billion lawsuit against the BBC for being fake news, you say that could be an opportunity, and that's quite intriguing. Tell us about that.
Yeah, look, to take the edit question again, it's a subjective judgment, right? There's no right or wrong answer to that. But the reason why I do think that the reaction to, let's leave aside the rest of the dossier for a moment, but the idea that somehow that edit suggests a sort of fundamental partiality from the BBC about Trump and his role on January the 6th is, it's laughable. It's laughable. Yeah, it was a sloppy edit. It shouldn't have been made. All it needed was a white flash to indicate that some time had passed between the two things, right? And it was unfair to Trump because it misrepresented what he said in that moment. But can anyone seriously say that it misrepresented what he did on that day and every other day leading up to that moment?
But that's why people are so, that's why people like, I'm so angry about it, is that I don't think they needed to do that. I think they needed to edit it that way because what Trump actually said was damning enough, and they've handed ammunition to his fake news narrative.
I completely agree with you, and it is sloppy and unfortunate, and it's it's been catastrophic because of the reaction. So I don't disagree with you at all. But I'm just sort of saying, if we're just talking, if we leave aside the kind of fevered absurdity of the reaction and just sort of think about it just objectively in itself, does anyone seriously believe that the person who did that, right, was doing it because they were trying to misrepresent or to try and make Trump seem worse than he was, right? Because they didn't need to, for precisely the reason that you have just said. It will have happened because, as so often with these things, it would have just been a mistake, an error. And frankly, in journalism, including in broadcast journalism, those sorts of edits happen all the time. And we know actually it wasn't considered particularly outrageous or egregious. Why? Not a single person complained about this. That doesn't mean it's objectively right, by the way, just because no one complained about it. But I think anybody watching that at the time would not have considered it to be a fundamental misrepresentation of what Trump did that day. And we know that because of the fact that he was impeached, including with Republican votes, for what he did at that time. We know that because of the meticulous congressional inquiries into his role that day. And most of all, we know that because the January 6th insurrectionists, rioters, whatever you want to call them, In their interviews since, Jeff Trump has obviously pardoned, by the way, in the interviews with them since, so many of them have quite literally said that they were there that day and were doing what they did that day because they thought they were doing what Trump wanted to do. If Trump hadn't lied about the election, right? If Trump hadn't lied about the election and continues to lie about it to this day, then none of them would have been there. So my contention with the edit is that, yes, it was sloppy. You're completely right that it's handed a gift, manna from heaven, to Trump and all of his supporters in this country. But on any objective level, was it a serious breach of impartiality? No, I don't believe that it was. And if we lived in a more sane media environment, we wouldn't have been having the debate that we've been having.
But you still think that the lawsuit that Trump's suing the BBC and bringing the BBC into his narrative rewriting, which is essentially what he's doing when it comes to rewriting history, you think that's an opportunity for the BBC?
I do, and I don't just think it's an opportunity for the BBC. I think it's actually necessary, and I think for this reason. Look, the BBC should indeed, they have apologised for the edit, and again, in a more sort of same world, that would be the end of the matter. But obviously, we're not in a same world. I think one of the sort of many tragicomic ironies of this whole story has been that the people involved in leaking this dossier to the Telegraph, they claim, and obviously the Trump edit claim was sort of central to this, they claim that they were doing that, I'm sure, or they claim to have been doing their work in the name of restoring the BBC's impartiality, particularly apropos of Trump. The irony of all this is that by doing that, and this story exploding in the way that it has, in my view, they have acted extremely partially, or the BBC has inadvertently acted partially, because what it has done is that it has supported a fundamental objective of Trump and the MAGA movement for a long time, which was to rewrite the history of what happened that day on January the 6th. And what it has done, if you were just a sort of, like most people are, right, because they're obviously not obsessed with all this stuff like, you and me.
Well, I think our listeners are.
Well, okay, but we're all weirdos, right? So let's try and try and place ourselves in the ordinary person for a second, right? They if you're only like half listening to this, or you've got 100th of your attention on this, probably the impression you've got is, the BBC misrepresented it to make it look like he called for violence, and he didn't. And so you've basically inadvertently augmented and supported the idea that Trump has tried to propagate for a long time, which is actually, it was nothing to do with him. He didn't call for violence. He didn't make that violence, worse. He didn't sort of allow those circumstances to fester. So in my view, yes, if Trump wants to sue the BBC should apologize for the edit. It should withdraw the program or change the edit and so on. But they should stick to their guns and say that if you want to sue us for defamation of character for what you did on January the 6th, then go right ahead. Stick to our journalism, because of the fundamental truth is Trump has no reputation to defend or indeed defame in terms of what happened on January 6th for all the reasons that I said. The truth is the truth and the facts are the facts. And if the BBC can't stand up for facts and truth and actually do so in the name of impartiality and truth, then there is no point to the organisation, in my view. And every legal analysis that I have seen says that on that basis, they would win.
Well, that brings me to a really interesting, wider question, I think. We spoke to our colleague at the Statesman, Hannah Barnes, earlier this week, who also has a long career at the BBC. And we started by asking her what the BBC is and what it should be. And I'd be really interested in hearing your views on that, particularly as somebody who left the BBC in order to, as you say, be able to pursue journalism in a direction that you didn't feel like you were able to do at Newsnight.
Look, I think that I think that there are. I think the systemic challenges for the BBC are so profound. I mean, they're so profound. They're profound technologically. I mean, when I think to when I started first as a producer in 2012, the kind of how different the political media world is by comparison to then. I mean, even then, broadcasting in its traditional form was still hegemonic. I mean, Twitter had only been going for 3 years, right? It was just this sort of thing just in a corner that was kind of a bit of a kind of triviality and a bit of a kind of sort of exotic thing. And it was just sort of on the side. The digital world was very much in that camp as well. And I think that in terms of the politics as well, the BBC, the reason it struggled so much in recent years is the BBC was fine when the fundamental political division was an economic one. And it was a sort of reasonably clear left-right axis. and you could kind of sort of come to a sort of roughly sort of middling position on those things, and it was easy to represent. With politics sort of dissected in along so many different axes now, it finds itself, particularly on questions of culture, where there is no bridging of those positions, in a really, really difficult position. The issue that obviously Hannah has worked so much on in terms of sort of gender critical stuff, trans rights, all those sorts of things is a great example, right? I mean, on the trans question, you either believe a trans woman is a woman or you don't, right? That is that has been where the debate has gone. And in that situation, it becomes very, very difficult for the BBC to kind of not anger people, even in the way that it sort of talks about its language. So I think politically and technologically, it's in a really, really difficult position. But in this world, there should be a place. My worry about the BBC is that because of the pressures from within and without, for the reasons I've just described, I think what has happened is that it has just gone, a bit like the Labour Party, it goes further and further into the kind of crouch position and defensive position. And there's a weird thing about the BBC where I always felt when I was there that increasingly it wanted to be two things at once that it couldn't, which is ubiquitous but unnoticed. And that is an impossible position to be in. And I think what the BBC should do, in a way, a bit like the Labour Party, is that it should roll the dice and it should actually be unapologetic, right? Unapologetic in strong, strident, experimental journalism and experimental television. It's the only way. Too much of the BBC output, because of all of the criticism that it's received, right, is defensive. It's banal. It sort of ends up sort of sitting in a kind of twee place because that's the safe place because no one will complain about it. And that way lies ruin and irrelevance. So what I would like to see from a new Director General who's coming in is to say that in this world that we're in, that the BBC could afford to take some risks again. But I suspect it won't for all the reasons that we've talked about.
Well, you've been making comparisons between the crisis at the BBC and the crisis at the Labour Party, which segues beautifully into the other big story of this week, which is what is going on in Number 10 with briefings against Wes Streeting, with counter briefings, with something that seems to have been intended as four-dimensional chess and has blown up in everyone's faces. In your view, speaking to people in Parliament, like, what is going on?
I think what you're seeing, I think there's all the briefing and counter briefing stuff, right? I mean, you sort of get completely lost in it because it's just such a classic kind of it's a classic like Westminster thing that you and I and people like us love to talk about. And I think the big picture stuff, right, of this is the collapse and the astonishing collapse, right, very rapidly of the authority of the centre. And the authority of Number 10. I mean, whoever leaked what to whom, and I think we can all probably make reasonably educated guesses about who that was. What to me stood out about the Streeting stuff this week was the fact that you had a cabinet minister, admittedly a very nimble communicator in the way that Streeting is, who manages to both sound, on the face of it, sound incredibly loyal, whilst adverting to the fact about how fundamentally maybe disloyal he is and how much better communicator he is than Starmer. But the fundamental thing was he felt able to go on television and sort of express some fealty to the Prime Minister at the same time as attacking in the most vociferous terms his own Number 10.
Yeah, toxic, he called it.
Toxic, and I don't know about you, I can't remember anything quite like that. I mean, I really can't remember any I mean, there've been noises around some of that sort of stuff I know from some cabinet ministers, particularly during the leadership election and so on. But actually for Wes Streeting in those terms to call Keir Starmer's Number 10 toxic, and actually for the expectation in those circumstances not to be on Streeting to backtrack and apologise, but for Starmer to go and find him and talk to him and apologise and reassure him, I think just tells you just how rapidly and extraordinarily Starmer's and his Number 10's authority over the cabinet has diminished. And I think that is, I think it's remarkable, really.
Well, Alva Ray has written this week's New Statesman cover story on basically exactly that, on does Keir Starmer realise how unpopular he has become with his own party and the extent to which he's stuck in a bunker mentality and not able to sort of really get a sense of what else is going on. And we talked about that on the podcast yesterday. Do you think that there's a way out, a sort of start listening now and get to grips with it all? Or is this something that we've seen with parties and governments previously, where once you get this level of briefing and counter briefing and toxicity out in the open, it's very difficult to row back?
Well, I think it is. I think it is difficult to row back. And look, I think one of the kind of like fundamentals here, isn't it, is that and the BBC has finds this as well, right? Is like the extraordinary kind of like acceleration in political time. Like, I mean, political time is like dog years now. So sometimes like people say like, oh my God, how could this have only have happened in when you're 15 months in or 16 months in, whatever it is. And it's like, yeah, in one sense that is amazing. But there is a reason that very often this can feel like sort of year 7 or year 8 of the government when it's not even in year 2, because it's just the sort of acceleration
Do you
of
ever get to
everything, right?
Tuesday in a week and go, oh, it's been a long week, and then realize it's only Tuesday? Because that happens to me every week.
I get to Monday morning and I feel that way. I don't know how it is. Like, it's just, and so how it must feel for them, by the way, in the centre. I mean, sort of one can only imagine. But anyway, I think that I think it is difficult, and I think it's especially difficult when you consider that, of course, it might be one thing if we were in this space after the really difficult structural moments to come, i.e., the budget and the May elections, and sort of the worst had gone. But of course, we're not. We're not even at that point yet. We're not at the budget, which is going to be bad and very difficult for Labour MPs. And by the way, I know it's sort of become a bit like received wisdom that somehow that like the brave thing for Reeves to do is to increase taxes and so on. I know it's something the New Statesman has talked about. I personally think that is a going back on the manifesto promise, talking to Labour MPs in particular about it. I think that is a slow motion political car crash waiting to happen. I really do. I think it's going to be a Clegg type moment. I don't think it will be recoverable for her. I don't think it will be recoverable for him. And in some ways, rightly so, right? Because that was the embodiment, that decision not to say that they wouldn't increase taxes under any circumstance. It was the embodiment of so many of the problems in which they're now facing, where basically, I mean, for my money, I mean, there are so many problems with this government, but for my money, the biggest one of all was the timidity in a run-up to the election itself. And it wasn't just timidity. I think it was a complacency. I genuinely think that people around at the top of the Labour Party at that time, because they'd been playing sort of politics in a very rare moment for the Labour Party on easy mode, pretty much from when Truss was made the debacle that she did, and it was clear Labour were heading for government.
Before that, when Partygate tore the Conservative Party apart.
Partygate, completely. And there was almost an incentive, because their polling leads were so big. There was an incentive not to think bigger, right? Don't say anything. It was the Ming bars thing, right? All the time. And it was so obvious from that time that would be fine in opposition, but it would be catastrophic for government, right? And they are now finding themselves in a position where the basic, I think, political and philosophical, intellectual assumption at that time was that basically Britain's biggest problem were the Tories, because they were feckless and they were riven and they were useless and they were ideological. And like a bit like the little yellow man on Google, as soon as you like picked them up and threw them away, everything would just be fine. Everything would just be fine because we're going to have some grown-ups in charge, right? And of course, it did help getting rid of the feckless and the riven and the useless, and they were like all of those things in so many ways. But the truth is that Britain's political problems and economic problems are so deeply seated that it required a lot of big thinking and quite a fundamental analysis of the diagnosis of that and the prescription. And in a sense, they did have a big diagnosis. They talked big on diagnosis. They would talk about Britain is fundamentally broken. We need fundamental change. We need, change was on the manifesto. But the contradiction at the heart of the Starmer project from the beginning was they were big on diagnosis and absolutely nowhere on prescription. It's like, Britain's broken. It needs fixing. Here are some tiny things to fix it. Like, it was always such an asymmetry. And to me, that is a thing that has come and just completely bitten them. And now they're having to be in a position where they're having to try and think in the job, in that kind of like dog-year political environment that we were just talking about, thinking on the job to try and do that on the hop, and which is almost impossible. So I just think that the seeds of this were sown long, long ago.
Final question, just to bring back the BBC and the Labour Party together. I don't know if you watched Lisa Nandy in the Commons earlier this week, answering questions on the BBC and offering a sort of Labour government defence of it, but also very much trying to avoid, I would say, committing news, as politicians often try to do. Do you think their response has been robust enough? How do you think the government should have responded or should be responding to the criticisms of our national broadcaster, including from some people outside of the UK who would really like it to cease to exist?
I think it is difficult for them because of the Trump connection, right? And as ever, they're having to sort of duck and weave a little bit because they don't want to. On the one hand, I think that their instincts will clearly be that sort of, Trump is wrong and they want to defend the BBC and whatever. But on the other hand, they don't want to piss him off. And, we've seen this game time and time again, right? So in a sense, it's quite familiar. What I'd say is I think that the link between the Labour and the BBC is this. They both act in very similar ways, right? Which is, I think they're both so afraid, as non-populist forces often are, of exercising power and their own power. It feels like so often they're afraid of their own shadows. And populist forces, in fairness to them, are not. They are not afraid about exercising power. So what would a sort of reform government be doing right now, or even like a Tory government, probably led by Johnson or Badenoch or whatever? If there was a Labour equivalent, they would be demanding Gibbs' resignation. Let's say we don't have the power to get rid of him, but they'd be demanding his resignation. Or they would say, we don't have the power to do this. But you know what? We've got our own impartiality concerns. Yeah, those impartiality concerns are clearly serious. We've got our own impartiality concerns. But they don't, because they're so scared. They're so scared to exercise any power. And they always have to be the kind of good guys defending the institutions and whatever. And that matters, and I admire it in a sense. But there have been real concerns raised and aired over the last couple of days, which should concern a Labour government. And they shouldn't be afraid to actually make their presence and their power felt a little bit in the way that, look, what's amazing right now, Richard? What's amazing right now? Who are the people in the frame, right? In the frame that everyone's talking about who might be the next DG or whatever. So many of them basically, or chairman, if the chair vacancy was going on. They're all basically people on the right, or the people that Farage would like, or GB News would like. We've got a Labour government with majority of over 160. And this again kind of like shows how it illustrates how so often right now Labour are in office, but they feel like they're not in power because so often they're not willing to exercise that power or at least even just threaten to exercise that power. And the BBC is a bit like that as well. That's why I say they should accept and indeed relish a Trump lawsuit, because it would show to the world, because think about all those US media companies which have cowed and bowed and scraped to Trump. It would show to the world, but also to license fee payers in the UK, that doesn't matter how powerful somebody is, whether it's the president of the United States, that in terms of if we get a mistake wrong, we'll say so. But the fundamentals of truth and journalism, we will defend. And it would be a statement, and it would be gutsy, and it would be the sort of thing a populist force would do in the other direction. And for all of those reasons, it's almost certain why the BBC won't do it.